United States Navy's story begins with sail and ends in steel, two eras that reshaped the seas. The Old Navy, small, respected, and born of wooden hulls and wind. It would pioneer ironclads during the Civil War, pointing to a new age. On October 13, 1775, Congress created the Continental Navy. A modest fleet took shape, challenging empire on open water. After independence, it was disbanded, its mission seemingly complete. But the young republic still needed protection far from home. Barbary piracy menaced American commerce in the Mediterranean. The Naval Act of 1794 answered with a permanent navy. 6 powerful frigates were authorized. Rugged, fast, heavily armed. Icons like USS Constitution would soon prove their worth. A professional force emerged, drilled and ready for blue water. Undeclared war with France tested the new fleet. American frigates fought convoy battles and captured privateers. Hard lessons forged tactics and confidence at sea. Against the Barbary states, the Navy sailed for sustained combat. Blockades, raids, and bold actions brought tribute demands to heel. American resolve secured freer passage for its merchantmen. In 1812, the Navy faced the world's premier sea power. Single-ship victories electrified the nation and stunned Britain. On lakes and coasts, control shifted with daring and seamanship. By war's end, the Navy's reputation was firmly set. Peace returned, but missions multiplied across wide oceans. Crews fought piracy and opposed the Atlantic slave trade. Stations stretched from the Mediterranean to West Africa.
The Civil War began, and the U.S. Navy fought the small Confederate States Navy with both sailing ships and new revolutionary ironclad ships, while forming a blockade that shut down the Confederacy's civilian coastal shipping. After the Civil War, most of its ships were laid up in reserve, and by 1878, the Navy was just 6,000 men.
In 1882, the U.S. Navy consisted of many outdated ship designs. Over the next decade, Congress approved building multiple modern steel-hulled armored cruisers and battleships, and by around the start of the 20th century, had moved from 12th place in 1870 to 5th place in terms of numbers of ships. Most sailors were foreigners. After winning 2 major battles during the 1898 Spanish-American War, the American Navy continued to build more ships, and by the end of World War I, had more men and women in uniform than the British Royal Navy. The Washington Naval Conference of 1921 recognized the Navy as equal in capital ship size to the Royal Navy. And during the 1920s and 1930s, the Navy built several aircraft carriers and battleships. The Navy was drawn into World War II after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and over the next 4 years fought many historic battles, including the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Battle of Midway, multiple naval battles during the Guadalcanal Campaign, and the largest naval battle in history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Much of the Navy's activity concerned the support of landings, not only with the island-hopping campaign in the Pacific, but also with the European landings. When the Japanese surrendered, a large flotilla entered Tokyo Bay to witness the formal ceremony conducted on the battleship Missouri, on which officials from the Japanese government signed the Japanese Instrument of Surrender. By the end of the war, the Navy had over 1,600 warships.
After World War II ended, the U.S. Navy entered the 45-year-long Cold War and participated in the Korean and Vietnam proxy wars. Nuclear power and ballistic and guided missile technology led to new ship propulsion and weapon systems, which were used in the Nimitz-class aircraft carriers and Ohio-class submarines. By 1978, the number of ships had dwindled to less than 400, many of which were from World War II, which prompted Ronald Reagan to institute a program for a modern 600-ship Navy. Following the 1990-91 collapse of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Navy was divided among the former Soviet republics and was left without funding, which made the United States the world's undisputed naval superpower, with the ability to engage and project power in 2 simultaneous limited wars along separate fronts. This ability was demonstrated during the First and Second Persian Gulf Wars. In March 2007, the U.S. Navy reached its smallest fleet size with 274 ships since World War I. Former U.S. Navy admirals who head the U.S. Naval Institute have raised concerns about what they see as the ability to respond to aggressive moves by Iran and China. The United States Navy was overtaken by the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy in terms of raw number of ships in 2020.
Continental Navy, 1775 to 1785. Main article, Continental Navy. Further information, Naval Battles of the American Revolutionary War. The Navy was rooted in the American seafaring tradition, which produced a large community of sailors, captains, and shipbuilders during the colonial era. During the Revolution, several states operated their own navies. On June 12, 1775, the Rhode Island General Assembly passed a resolution creating a navy for the colony of Rhode Island. The same day, Governor Nicholas Cook signed orders addressed to Captain Abraham Whipple, commander of the sloop Katy and commodore of the armed vessels employed by the government. The first formal movement for the creation of the Continental Navy came from Rhode Island, because the widespread smuggling activities of Rhode Island merchants had been increasingly suppressed by the British Royal Navy. On August 26, 1775, Rhode Island passed a resolution that there be a single continental fleet funded by the Continental Congress. The resolution was introduced in the Continental Congress on October 3, 1775, but was tabled. In the meantime, George Washington had begun to acquire ships, starting with the schooner USS Hannah that was paid for out of Washington's own pocket. Hannah was commissioned and launched on September 5, 1775, under the command of Captain Nicholson Broughton, from the port of Marblehead, Massachusetts.
The U.S. Navy recognizes October 13, 1775, as the date of its official establishment, the date of the passage of the resolution of the Continental Congress at Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, that created the Continental Navy. On this day, Congress authorized the purchase of 2 vessels to be armed for a privateering cruise against British merchant shipping. On December 13, 1775, Congress authorized the building of 13 frigates within the next 3 months, 5 ships of 32 guns, 5 with 28 guns, and 3 with 24 guns. On Lake Champlain, Benedict Arnold ordered the construction of 12 naval vessels to slow down the progress of British forces which had entered New York from Canada. In the ensuing engagement, a Royal Navy fleet decisively defeated Arnold's ships after 2 days of fighting, but the battle managed to slow down the progression of British ground forces in New York. By mid-1776, a number of ships, ranging up to and including the 13 frigates approved by Congress, were under construction, but their effectiveness was limited. They were completely outmatched by the Royal Navy, and nearly all were captured or sunk by 1781. One particularly notable American naval officer of the Revolutionary War was John Paul Jones, who, a voyage around the British Isles, captured the Royal Navy frigate Serapis, 1779, in the Battle of Flamborough Head. Partway through the battle, with the rigging of the 2 ships entangled and several guns of Jones's ship Bonhomme Richard, 1765, out of action, the captain of Serapis asked Jones if he had struck his colors, to which Jones has been quoted as replying, "I have not yet begun to fight." France officially entered the war on June 17, 1778, and ships of the French Navy sent to the Western Hemisphere spent most of the year in the West Indies and only sailed near the 13 colonies during the Caribbean hurricane season from July until November. A French Navy fleet attempted landings in New York and Rhode Island in 1778, but ultimately failed to engage British forces. In 1779, a fleet commanded by Vice Admiral Charles Henri Comte d'Estaing assisted American forces attempting to recapture Savannah, Georgia.
Disarmament, 1785 to 1794. Further information, United States Revenue Cutter Service. The Revolutionary War was ended by the Treaty of Paris in 1783, and by 1785 the Continental Navy was disbanded and the remaining ships were sold.
The frigate Alliance, which had fired the last shots of the American Revolutionary War, was also the last ship in the Navy. A faction within Congress wanted to keep the ship, but the new nation did not have the funds to keep her in service. Other than a general lack of money, factors for the disarmament of the Navy were the loose confederation of the states, a change of goals from war to peace, and more domestic and fewer foreign interests. After the American Revolutionary War, the brand new United States struggled to stay financially afloat. National income was desperately needed, and most came from tariffs on imported goods. Because of rampant smuggling, the need was immediate for strong enforcement of tariff laws. On August 4, 1790, the United States Congress, urged on by Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, created the Revenue Marine, the forerunner for the United States Coast Guard, to enforce the tariff and all other maritime laws. 10 cutters were initially ordered. Between 1790 and 1797, when the Navy Department was created, the Revenue Marine was the only armed maritime service for the United States. American merchant shipping had been protected by the Royal Navy during the colonial era, but as a consequence of the Treaty of Paris and the disarmament of the Continental Navy, the United States no longer had any protection for its ships from pirates. The fledgling nation did not have the funds to pay annual tribute to the Barbary States, so their ships were vulnerable for capture after 1785. By 1789, the new Constitution of the United States authorized Congress to create a navy, but during George Washington's first term, 1787 to 1793, little was done to rearm the Navy. In 1793, the French Revolutionary Wars between Great Britain and France began, and a truce negotiated between Portugal and Algiers ended Portugal's blockade of the Strait of Gibraltar, which had kept the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean. Soon after, the pirates sailed into the Atlantic and captured 11 American merchant ships and more than 100 seamen.
In reaction to the seizure of the American vessels, Congress debated and approved the Naval Act of 1794, which authorized the building of 6 frigates, 4 of 44 guns and 2 of 36 guns. Supporters were mostly from the northern states and coastal regions, who argued the Navy would result in savings in insurance and ransom payments, while opponents from southern states and inland regions thought a Navy was not worth the expense and would drive the United States into more costly wars.
Establishment 1794 to 1812. Further information: Naval Act of 1794, original 6 frigates of the United States Navy, quasi-war, First Barbary War, and impressment of American seamen. After the passage of the Naval Act of 1794, work began on the construction of the 6 frigates: USS United States, President, Constellation, Chesapeake, Congress, and Constitution. Constitution, launched in 1797, and the most famous of the 6, was nicknamed Old Ironsides, like the earlier HMS Britannia, and, thanks to the efforts of Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., is still in existence today, anchored in Boston Harbor. Soon after the bill was passed, Congress authorized $800,000 to obtain a treaty with the Algerians and ransom the captives, triggering an amendment of the act which would halt the construction of ships if peace was declared. After considerable debate, 3 of the 6 frigates were authorized to be completed: United States, Constitution, and Constellation. However, the first naval vessel to sail was USS Ganges on May 24, 1798.
At the same time, tensions between the U.S. and France developed into the Quasi-War, which originated from the Treaty of Alliance 1778 that had brought the French into the Revolutionary War. The United States preferred to take a position of neutrality in the conflicts between France and Britain, but this put the nation at odds with both the British and French. After the Jay Treaty was signed with Great Britain in 1794, France began to side against the United States, and by 1797 they had seized over 300 American vessels. The newly inaugurated President John Adams took steps to deal with the crisis, working with Congress to finish the 3 almost completed frigates, approving funds to build the other 3, and attempting to negotiate an agreement similar to the Jay Treaty with France. The XYZ affair originated with a report distributed by Adams where alleged French agents were identified by the letters X, Y, and Z, who informed the delegation a bribe must be paid before the diplomats could meet with the foreign minister. And the resulting scandal increased popular support in the country for a war with France. Concerns about the War Department's ability to manage a navy led to the creation of the Department of the Navy, which was established on April 30, 1798.
The war with France was fought almost entirely at sea, mostly between privateers and merchant ships. The first victory for the United States Navy was on July 7, 1798, when USS Delaware captured the French privateer Le Croyable, and the first victory over an enemy warship was on February 9, 1799, when the frigate Constellation captured the French frigate L'Insurgente. By the end of 1800, peace with France had been declared, and in 1801, to prevent a second disarmament of the Navy, the outgoing Federalist administration rushed through Congress an act authorizing a peacetime Navy for the first time, which limited the Navy to 6 active frigates and 7 in ordinary, as well as 45 officers and 150 midshipmen. The remainder of the ships in service were sold, and the dismissed officers were given 4 months' pay.
The problems with the Barbary States had never gone away, and on May 10, 1801, the Tripolitans declared war on the United States by chopping down the flag in front of the American embassy, which began the First Barbary War. USS Philadelphia was captured by the Moors, but then set on fire in an American raid led by Stephen Decatur. The Marines invaded the shores of Tripoli in 1805, capturing the city of Derna, the first time the U.S. flag ever flew over a foreign conquest. This act was enough to induce the Barbary rulers to sign peace treaties. Subsequently, the Navy was greatly reduced for reasons of economy, and instead of regular ships, many gunboats were built, intended for coastal use only. This policy proved completely ineffective within a decade. President Thomas Jefferson and his Democratic-Republican Party opposed a strong navy, arguing that the small gunboats stationed in the major Atlantic harbors, part of First Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton's U.S. Revenue Marine, were all the nation needed to defend itself. However, this small fleet of lightly armed revenue cutters, which Hamilton had proposed in Federalist Papers No. 11 and 12, was insufficient as a wartime naval force for the needs of the new United States of America.
During the French Revolutionary Wars, the Royal Navy had begun to impress sailors from American ships who they alleged were British deserters. An estimated 10,000 sailors were impressed this way between 1799 and 1812. In 1807, in the Chesapeake Leopard affair, HMS Leopard demanded that Chesapeake submit to an inspection for British deserters on board, which was rejected. Leopard responded by opening fire on Chesapeake and forcibly searched the ship, removing 5 deserters from the Royal Navy. The most violent of many such encounters, the affair further fueled tensions between the two nations, and in June 1812, the U.S. declared war on Britain.
War of 1812, 1812 to 1815. Further information, War of 1812. Much of the war was expected to be fought at sea, and within an hour of the announcement of war, the diminutive U.S. Navy set forth to do battle with an opponent outnumbering it 50-1. After 2 months, Constitution sank HMS Guerrière. Guerrière's crew were most dismayed to see their cannonballs bouncing off Constitution's unusually strong live oak hull, giving her the enduring nickname of Old Ironsides. On December 29, 1812, Constitution defeated HMS Java off the coast of Brazil, and Java was burned after the Americans determined she could not be salvaged. On October 25, 1812,
United States captured HMS Macedonian. After the battle, Macedonian was captured and entered into American service. In 1813, USS Essex commenced a very fruitful raiding venture into the South Pacific under the command of David Porter, preying upon the British merchant and whaling industry. Essex was already known for her capture of HMS Alert and a British transport the previous year, and gained further success capturing 15 British merchant ships. The British finally took action, dispatching HMS Cherub and HMS Phoebe to stop the Essex. The two ships, under the command of Sir James Hillyer, blockaded Essex before Porter ordered his ship to attempt to escape. In the ensuing battle, Essex was captured by the British.
The capture of the 3 Royal Navy frigates led the British to deploy more vessels on the American seaboard to tighten their blockade of U.S. ports. On June 1, 1813, off Boston Harbor, the American frigate Chesapeake, commanded by Captain James Lawrence, was captured by the British frigate HMS Shannon under Captain Sir Philip Broke. Lawrence was mortally wounded and famously cried out, "Don't give up the ship." Despite their earlier successes, by 1814 many of the Navy's best ships were blockaded in port and unable to prevent British incursions on land via the sea. During the summer of 1814, the British fought the Chesapeake Campaign, which was climaxed by amphibious assaults against Washington and Baltimore. The capital fell to the British almost without a fight, and several American warships were burned at the Washington Navy Yard, including the 44-gun frigate USS Columbia. At Baltimore, the bombardment by Fort McHenry inspired Francis Scott Key to write the Star-Spangled Banner, and the hulks blocking the channel prevented the fleet from entering the harbor. The Army re-embarked on the ships, ending the battle. The American naval victories at the Battle of Lake Champlain and Battle of Lake Erie halted the final British offensive in the north and helped to deny the British exclusive rights to the Great Lakes in the Treaty of Ghent. Shortly before the treaty was signed, President was captured by 4 British frigates. 3 days after the treaty was signed, Constitution captured HMS Levant and Cyane. The final naval action of the war occurred almost 5 months after the treaty on June 30, 1815, when the sloop USS Peacock captured the East India Company brig Nautilus, the last enemy ship captured by the U.S. Navy until World War II.